The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local community-centered journalism today by signing up to be a monthly sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. It doesn't take much money to support local news.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. The company that built the Nanaimo Bastion could be looking at the end of the line. The Hudson's Bay Company is seeking creditor protection and is expected to begin liquidating inventory at stores across Canada in the very near future. On today's program, we're going to explore what's going on with the Bay now, and we'll also hear about the role it played in Nanaimo's coal mining roots.
Hi, I'm Charles Schell, and I'm a professor in finance in the Department of Finance and Quantitative Methods at Vancouver Island University. I specialize in areas like venture capital, but also credit, and I've produced about 4 books on corporate credit analysis. So a lot of my focus, part of my adult life, has been looking at businesses when they get into trouble.
And that is exactly what we're going to be talking about today with the Hudson's Bay Company. Maybe the place to start. Could you explain to me what exactly creditor protection is and how it works as relates to this process?
Yeah, when the company realizes that they don't have enough assets or even the prospect of being able to cover all of their debts, they go into a process called the Company Creditor Arrangement Act. It's a lot like the Chapter 11 that you hear about in the United States, where a company, through the lawyers, will approach a judge and ask for protection from creditors. That means the creditors can no longer do things like sue to get recovery of their assets. They can't impede the business. The business will continue to run, but under the administration of the judge and a company that's usually set up as the monitor for the business.
So this is all still playing out before a judge in the court system. What exactly is the Hudson's Bay Company hoping comes out of this process?
Well, it's pretty hard to look into the mind of the people who are behind the leadership at Hudson's Bay, because it's a very complicated organization with several different businesses. Some of those have been spun off into other things, but you know, for the people who are running the stores, the people who are running HBC, they very much want to see the company continue to operate. They would like to reorganize, and after a period of reorganization, come out of that process with perhaps a much smaller organization with fewer stores, but in a position where they would be solvent and be able to continue. That may not be possible, and that's really why we have a point of crisis right now, where the stores are perhaps looking at liquidation, which is almost always the end process in this kind of insolvency.
So it's been reported there are court filings. You can go and look and see some of the creditors of the HBC and how much they're owed. It's close to $1 billion if we're interested in maybe some of the local aspects. They owe the company that owns the Woodgrove Center. Well, for Nanaimo and the Woodgrove Center, they owe just over $410,000 according to those filings. Also, that company owns one of the malls in Victoria, so they owe in total $800 and some thousand. What do we need to know about maybe the secured creditors versus the unsecured creditors, and how much the HBC owes who, and which of those groups is likeliest to see any money from this?
Yeah, the process of insolvency typically leads to liquidation, and if the business is liquidated, then there's a pecking order. There's a hierarchy of creditors. The secured creditors are the ones who are going to more likely receive a large portion of their debt. But the good news, I guess, is that also in that list we have employees will receive funding near the top of the pecking order. You know, to take a step back, the pecking order really does start with a lot of the debt that's being incurred after the insolvency process has started. So if you're working for HBC after or you're selling to HBC or providing services to HBC after the insolvency, you're going to get paid out because that's a special class of creditors. Then after the payments that are made out during the insolvency process starts, there are the secured creditors, and government is usually in there as well. They get paid out at the top of the list. Things like sales taxes and anything owing to Revenue Canada, anything owing to WorkSafe BC. Organizations like that will be at the top of the list. Then there are the unsecured creditors. The unsecured creditors, typically would be smaller creditors, but in the case of HBC, we have some really big ones. Some of those famous brands that maybe owed $15-16 million for inventory that's been provided mostly within the last year and not been paid for. And that goes right down to the local service business that has provided things like security services. One company in Mill Bay, for example, I think owed about $30,000. The City of Victoria is on the list as well. A number of smaller creditors. The good news, I guess, I didn't see anyone from Nanaimo on that list. I saw about 20 entities on Vancouver Island. And most of the debt is, as you say, either owed to the landlords, the two major landlord groups, or the government in taxes.
If we were to go hyper local on this, it's been reported that nationwide, the Hudson's Bay Company has just over 9,000 employees. If we're thinking about the employees who might be here in Nanaimo, what's likely to happen to them in terms of benefits, severance, pensions, that sort of thing?
Yeah, that will depend on the type of employees, and some employees will be required, if there's a liquidation, to not required, but they'll be given the opportunity to continue working through the liquidation process, and they'll be paid at their normal scale by the liquidator. In fact, we have got the monitoring firm that will be essentially co-signing all of the checks for management. Local management will, be able to continue. The directors of the business will continue and be paid, and services that are required by the insolvent business will also be paid out by the monitor. So if HBC does need to, buy additional material, hire a security firm, whatever they need to do, that's going to be guaranteed by the monitor. The terms of contracts doesn't change as long as the business continue to operate. So things like pensions will continue to accrue. I know in any case where there is an insolvency, pensions are usually the messiest part of this. And that means that we've got some people who have put a lot of faith in a certain income in retirement. And that might not be as generous as they'd hoped. We saw, for example, the Sears case where people who were already retired were worried about the generous benefits that Sears had promised them during their employment. They generally did okay. Some of the employees who had not yet retired only got a percentage of the total pension that they had been promised, because there just wasn't the funding that was available. So that is also a concern. I know HBC has two different pension plans as a result of the acquisitions they've done in the past. One of them is fully funded. The other I see has got about $80 million shortfall, and I'm not exactly sure how that would affect people who are in the pension plan today.
You've used the phrase liquidation a number of times today. What would you expect is likely to happen to the Hudson's Bay Company store here in Nanaimo, and how would you expect that to play out as far as timelines?
Well, the word is now that the company hasn't been able to raise enough money to do a long liquidation followed by restructuring. So it does look like this will be a full liquidation. And the word is that this will take place probably over the next 10 to 12 weeks, and could start as early as later today, although more realistically, it'll probably happen towards the end of the week. That means that the store will be in a position to sell off its inventory. I see that nationwide, there's about almost $400 million worth of inventory, including inventory in the stores and also inventory in their distribution centers. And so that will quite possibly be sold through the stores to the point where there's not enough left to continue the sales, at which point any of the remaining inventory gets sold on through jobbers who will buy lots of the remaining inventory and sell it through other channels.
In terms of what will happen to maybe the space that the Hudson's Bay Company occupies now, people will know that Sears left the North Town Center a number of years ago, and that space is still sitting there empty. It's easy to talk about big retail not being what it used to be. Do you have any sense of what might happen in the future to the space and what the loss of the Hudson's Bay Company might mean for like the wider economy of the mall in the area?
Yeah, this is indicative of something that's happening everywhere in North America. Really, the large department stores have largely disappeared. In fact, HBC itself is kind of a combination of a lot of those stores. They bought out the assets of Woodward's and of Zellers and some of the Simpsons businesses back east from the old Simpson Sears. So HBC has actually collected a lot of real estate from other businesses in that particular model that are now gone, so that we really only have in Eastern Canada one store chain that operates the way those old giants used to. We've seen the difficulty that they have using the Sears location with things like pop-up stores as a partial replacement, but clearly there's no obvious use for that real estate. Perhaps the mall owners are going to find alternative uses. And I don't expect we're going to see another anchor tenant of the type of HBC that we've seen in the past.
For people who might be interested in, I don't know if it's fair to use a word like pecking at the Hudson's Bay Company like vultures as this process plays out, are there any important considerations to know?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the vulture aspect. The term that we use in private equity for the type of private equity they've got for the winding up period is called vulture capital. So the funding right now is coming at a really high interest rate for perhaps $20 million worth of funding to manage the wind up with relatively low risk. So the vultures indeed are circling. I don't know if there, really is going to be that in terms of their annual sales and the amount of inventory that they've got left. This is not really going to be a huge carcass for to feed on. In fact, it's an all-around tragedy with really no upside. We are seeing the demise of a over a very long period of time of one of those great companies. The likes of which we'll never see again. HBC itself has gone through a process that is probably about 20 years long of moving into the position that it is now. They were taken from being a public company, they were privatized, they were public again, they were privatized again, ownership transferred to the United States and in between two different companies, and some of the assets have been moved into the remaining American company, Saks Global. So it's a long and sad story that is kind of coming to an inevitable close.
Is there anything else you think it's important for people to know about what's going on with the Hudson's Bay Company, specifically here in Nanaimo?
Well, for customers, I think one of the most important things to know is that HBC owes its customers an awful lot in the HBC reward program, which was itself worth millions of dollars, that is no longer going to operate. So that's already been suspended. There's nothing that you can really do about that. Those points are going to expire without any real value. If you have gift cards, those gift cards will continue to be honored according to the company's release until April 6th. So you still have a little while to use your HBC gift cards as soon as the stores reopen for business. Perhaps some of the bad news, some of the more iconic HBC products like their famous blankets have already been sold out. So if you're looking for that great souvenir, unfortunately, I think that unless some inventory appears from a distribution center somewhere, the last couple were sold yesterday.
Charles Shell, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
Oh, my pleasure.
Charles CHLY is a professor in finance at Vancouver Island University.
Midcoast Morning is made possible by the Community Radio Fund of Canada and generous listeners like you. With your support, we can expand Midcoast Morning from 2 to 3 original programs per week to cover local news, current affairs, and arts and culture.
The Hudson's Bay Company is likely to be winding up operations at stores across the country in the coming months, including here in Nanaimo. The story of the company is deeply intertwined with the community's coal mining roots. I got in touch with Amy Greenway, curator of the Nanaimo Museum, for more on that subject. What role did the Hudson's Bay Company play in the history of Nanaimo?
So the role of the Hudson's Bay Company on Vancouver Island is very complex. In the early 1840s, the Hudson's Bay Company established a fort in what is now the Victoria area. By 1849, Vancouver Island was a crown colony of the British government, and the British government entered into a contract with the Hudson's Bay Company, where the Hudson's Bay Company ultimately leased Vancouver Island for a very nominal amount of money to the British government, and were expected to be encouraging British settlement on the island. And of course, when all of this was happening, there were approximately, and still are, approximately 50 First Nations well established on the island who cared for and been a part of this land for thousands of years. And what I find really interesting about HBC history in Nanaimo is so many of us learn about the Hudson's Bay Company in social studies in school, and it's very much a story of the fur trade. But in Nanaimo, the Hudson's Bay Company presence in Nanaimo was because of coal. So it's one of the few Hudson's Bay Company settlements not devoted to the fur trade, but rather at a time where the Hudson's Bay Company was looking to diversify and have different ways of bringing in money, and of course the decline of their most sought after pelts.
Can you give me more of a picture of what exactly that looks like when the Hudson's Bay Company says, oh, hey, there's coal around here? How does it go from that to where we are in 2025? Or even how does it go from that to people are living in the area to presumably mine coal? And what does the early community look like? Who are the different groups there? And what is the day-to-day?
In the early 1850s in Nanaimo, the community was very diverse. The Hudson's Bay Company very typically across Canada would graft onto long-established First Nations economies, village sites, and trade routes in order to access critically needed First Nations expertise, resources, and labor. Nanaimo was the same. So the Hudson's Bay Company settlement was in the shadow of a Snuneymuxw village. So there's that piece happening. So the part of downtown Nanaimo that people are familiar with that has the Bastion just very nearby is a very long-standing Snuneymuxw village. The Hudson's Bay Company workforce was very diverse. There were French Canadians, which many of us know from learning about in social studies being such an important part of work in the fur trade. But there were English settlers, settlers from Scotland, Indigenous Hawaiians, Haudenosaunee First Nation, whose territory is in present-day Quebec and other eastern provinces and states. They were part of the workforce here as well. So the community had people from a lot of different areas, and that in many cases is typical of the Hudson's Bay Company.
You talked a little bit about the Bastion there, at least the part of town it's in. The Bastion itself, what's the Hudson's Bay Company's connection to that building?
So Hudson's Bay Company employees built the Bastion. They started construction in 1853, so not too long after they'd started mining coal in Nanaimo. And the Bastion is the oldest building in Nanaimo that's still left for that reason.
And what exactly was the point of it? Why did the HBC build it?
The Hudson's Bay Company would very typically were, of course, they're building buildings when they go into their settlements. It's part of the process of creating a community. But with the Bastion specifically, the Hudson's Bay Company was very aware of American expansion, and they were also paying attention to some border discussions that were happening in Alaska. So the part of what the Hudson's Bay Company was doing on Vancouver Island was asserting British presence in this area. And the Bastion was a symbol of that.
You're the curator of the Nanaimo Museum. Yeah. When you take a look at this history of the Hudson's Bay Company in early Nanaimo, and you reflect on the news we've been hearing about how the Hudson's Bay Company today is in serious financial trouble, it maybe risks no longer existing in the near future. What does that mean to you? How do you think about that? What is the disappearance of it as a company? What does it make you reflect on?
So every time I reflect on the Hudson's Bay Company history, very long history in Canada, it's a very complex history, and many different people have different types of experiences with the Hudson's Bay Company. Many of us today, of course, it's the iconic type of department store. There's like some nostalgia connections that I think a lot of people think about. But for me, I usually end up coming right back to the history of the Hudson's Bay Company. And it is a history of the Hudson's Bay Company benefiting some people while disenfranchising others.
When it comes to the idea of just evaluating, even in today's context, a big, massive company is maybe going bust, and maybe there are some people who, as you say, feel this like wave of nostalgia of, oh, I used to shop there or something. How do you evaluate that sentiment of like, what does a company, which is ostensibly in the business of making money, what does the death of that mean and signal? Like, why would people be getting nostalgic about something like that?
For myself, I think that elements of the Hudson's Bay Company history, I think that there's so much happening in that history that it's important to acknowledge that complexity and that there are so many different perspectives. And that's actually an important part of history and an important part of, being in a society, that we have people that are thinking different ways. And I also think that a story that I think back to in Nanaimo's history is of the Métis community. So Joseph William Mackay grew up in the Hudson's Bay Company. He was born in Quebec. He spent some time in Fort Victoria and was sent to Nanaimo. And so he's the clerk who really established the settlement. He was working in a sawmill in Nanaimo. So he's this really interesting figure in Vancouver Island history. By 1856, he was elected to the first legislative assembly on Vancouver Island as a Métis man. So I think there's so many different layers of this story that it's just important to be thinking about all of those aspects, and that the situation isn't one way or the other. There's so much happening, and you can maybe have some nostalgia for a department store, but also recognize that this story has much deeper meaning to a lot of people in Canada for a diverse range of reasons and experiences.
Like you allude to there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of history of the Hudson's Bay Company. A number of different figures, each with their own story. I'm wondering if there are any sources you might recommend to people who are maybe interested, they're maybe feeling a little bit nostalgic, they would like to learn more about some of that history and they're not sure where to start, or if X, Y, or Z book is a good one.
Well, I am the worst person to give recommendations on books that support nostalgia, but I can recommend some awesome history resources. I would definitely say for people who really want to do a deep dive into, like maybe they're from Nanaimo or from the Mid-Island, what was happening here. There are on the Nanaimo Archives website some of the Hudson's Bay Company journals that were written by Joseph Mackay they're digitized. You can go on to the Nanaimo Archives website and you can just cruise through. It tells you what the weather is on, this day in 1852. And it tells you, who's working on building a house, who's mining for coal, what's happening. And so I find that really interesting because it ties us so strongly to this place, to the land here. And I think that I would say that's a really good starting point. And also just thinking about, whose perspective. Is there a perspective on the Hudson's Bay Company story that you don't know very much about, or maybe you don't really understand why people feel a certain way that's very different than the way you feel? Learn more about that. Listen to people from that community. That's one of the great things about, can be one of the great things about social media, is that you can hear from people that are on the East Coast, that are on the prairies, from, that are northern. What are their community experiences, and just be open to that complexity.
Amy Greenway is curator at the Nanaimo Museum. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and RB Fruit is our technical advisor. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, email us at news@chly.ca. That's all for now. I'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.
This program acknowledges and gives thanks to the Snuneymuxw First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.